It's easy to remember the past with rose-colored glasses. Old-timers often recall a time when people didn't lock their doors at night, when an assembly line job was enough to support a family of four, and seed oils were a non-issue. However, it's easy to forget corruption and bad actors have been with us since time immemorial. In 1921, a 12-year-old girl left her babysitting job in Madison, New Jersey, and headed for home. The houses were in the same neighborhood, door to door, less than 200 yards apart. However, she never made it back, and the investigation that followed was at the same time gruesome, tragic, and infuriating. The murder of Janette Lawrence. Welcome to Words and Coffee, where we talk interesting history about the Garden State and showcase a bag of small batch roasted goodness. Today's brew is Direct Action by Stocking Mill Coffee. And the history is the 1921 unsolved murder of Janette Lawrence in Madison, New Jersey. Let's get to it. It's Thursday, October 6th, 1921. Rosina Borland was at home preparing dinner, awaiting the return of her children. Her daughter Janette was 12 years old, a 7th grade student at Green Avenue School, and sometimes worked as a babysitter in the neighborhood. In fact, this evening Janette was sitting at a house less than 200 yards down the road, and so Rosina thought little of it. That was until Janette failed to return home. An hour later, Rosina started to get worried and called on neighbors and the police for help. A neighbor reported seeing Janette at about 5:35 that evening, so it was thought she couldn't have gone far. A search soon covered the surrounding streets, including a wooded area across from the Lawrences' home. An area called Kluxen Woods was at the corner of Fairview and Ridgedale Avenues. Remember that now, because you're going to be hearing it a lot. Sadly, this is where 2 Boy Scouts discovered the missing Janette. Fair warning, this isn't a happy one, so if you're sensitive about violence against, children, maybe give this one a pass. Janette's body was found with 23 stab wounds in the middle of Kluxen Woods. A handkerchief had been tied around her neck and another stuffed into her hat. Some of the stab wounds had pierced clothing and others had not, meaning she had been partially disrobed during the attack. Finally, her hands had been tied behind her back with a piece of cord. The woods were right across the street from her house, and she had passed through them many times, not always without incident. And we'll get to that. This discovery understandably shocked and horrified the town of Madison. This was a well-to-do, upper-middle-class neighborhood in a town known as Rose City. People wanted answers, and they were going to get them. So, the day after the discovery of Janette's body, the police had a pretty good idea of the guilty party. You see, witnesses had spotted a young man in the vicinity of Kluxen Woods the day of the murder. This person was known as a troublemaker in general, to the point he had been kicked out of school, and for having altercations with the victim in particular. A witness had also reported previously walking in on them and hearing Janette scream, "Let me go." And on another occasion he yelled, "I'll get you yet." Not looking good. His footprints were also found at the crime scene, and just the icing on this evil cake, he came home with red liquid covering his clothes. The day of the murder. Do you hear what I'm saying right now? Like I said, to the police, this seemed pretty cut and dry. The Madison Borough Council, and indeed most residents, likewise agreed.
But you could be wrong.
Thus, Police Chief Fred Johnson directed his men to arrest Francis Kluxen that afternoon. But here's the kicker. Shortly after arresting this young man, police were forced to let him go. You see, there had been a mistake. Apparently. You see, Francis had never entered the woods. Apparently. Nor had he ever really interacted with the victim. Apparently. Also, are you aware that my family owns the big winery in town? We're a pretty big deal.
My father will hear about this.
Those of you paying attention may have noticed that Kluxen Woods and Francis Kluxen have the same name. And yes, the answer is that the family that owned the land, which was adjacent to their family winery, owned the woods where the girl was murdered. So yeah, that red fluid all over my clothes. Grape juice. Grape juice.
Oh, well, it's cranberry juice, apple.
Really?
So, you see, it was all just a big, coincidental, awful misunderstanding. In case you can't tell, I am laying it on quite thick right now. So put a pin in all that, because we will return to it. Thus, the police were still looking for the, real killer, and with their number one suspect off the list, they were forced to get creative. They were quite clearly grasping at straws, because the next guy they brought in was Frank Felice, a homeless man who, quote, fit the description of someone seen in the area at the time of the murder. As this piece of quite dubious information was the only evidence, Frank was soon released. Thinking the harass the homeless angle was their best bet, they soon arrested another Frank Ruca. After being brought into the woods, he reportedly turned his head away from the exact spot of the murder without being told what it was.
Good work, Lou.
He, too, was soon released for lack of evidence. That brought the police back to square one, so they reviewed the basics. That's when they took a look at the binding used to tie Janette's wrists. It was identified as a piece of hempen cord typically used to bundle rose bushes. In fact, it was used locally, in neighboring Florham Park, which was home to several large greenhouses. And that's where the cops meant to find their killer. They landed on yet another Frank Jansarak, a 21-year-old employee of the greenhouse and one who had been spotted at the corner of Fairview and Ridgedale at 5 p.m. the night of the murder. He's also like the third Frank in the story, 4 if you count Francis. Regardless, Frank J's story was thus. He and his brother had made plans to talk about the second game in the World Series. In preparation for that, he stopped in at United Cigar Store in Madison at 5:20 to pick up a newspaper with coverage of the game. Then he headed for the corner, arriving at 5:30. Recall that Janette had last been seen at 5:35. Frank J. freely acknowledged that he was near the woods at the time of the murder, but steadfastly denied having entered. Still, since the police were under pressure to find the suspect,
No, not that one. No, not that one.
this was their only lead. Despite objections from most residents and the Madison Borough Council, Frank J. was arrested and put on trial. And this is where it became downright farcical. See, there was so little evidence to put the blame on Frank J., the whole string thing. Location, yes, but no prior association, no history of violence. Also, the footprints at the crime scene were the wrong size. The prosecution had very little to present. So, the defense took this opportunity to grill Chief Johnson on what evidence they did have, specifically that pertaining to Mr. Kluxen. Right, so whose footprints are these at the crime scene? Did you get any matches on those footprints at the crime scene? Oh, you did! You did get matches to those footprints at the crime scene. Who did those footprints belong to? So in effect, this became an unofficial trial of the first and effectively the primary suspect. Perhaps needless to say, Frank J. was acquitted in near record time. It's June 1922. Nearly 8 months had passed since Janette's murder, and finally the Borough Council and residents get what they wanted. Francis Kluxen has been indicted. Unfortunately, the public pressure was something of a double-edged sword. You see, the defense argued that Francis couldn't get a fair trial with jurors from Morris County. And that's fair enough. Thus, while the trial itself was held in Morristown, the jurors were pulled from neighboring Essex. Now 15 years old, Francis was an imposing boy, 6 feet 2 inches tall, 170 pounds. He certainly appeared capable of violence. His story amounted to this. He no longer attended school, and instead worked for his family at the winery. He didn't know Janette well, and never played with her. He was in the woods that evening, yes, but you see, it was because his pet rabbit had escaped, and he was searching for it with the help of his dog. His footprints were right through the crime scene, and he saw nothing.
Apparently every time.
I've already remarked on the red wine stains on his clothing. If my dripping sarcasm isn't evidence enough of my opinion on that, this was also presented as the first time such a thing had ever happened. Rotten luck, huh? Well, Kluxen's story was pretty much rebutted on all accounts. Multiple witnesses, neighbors of his, testified that they had observed him shouting at Janette on multiple occasions. In one case, he had grabbed her, and one of Janette's friends claimed Kluxen was always bothering her. Now, that's admittedly circumstantial, borderline hearsay. However, there was also Kluxen's pocket knife. It matched the size of the stab wounds on Janette's body. However, it had no blood on it. Never mind that you could, wash that in an afternoon, but it was also a fairly common size, so, meh. Circumstantial at best, it could have been anyone. You'd need something more personalized, something that could be tied directly to the murder. Well, you may recall those two handkerchiefs from the crime scene. One was tied around Janette's neck, and the other was stuffed in her cap. They were monogrammed, possibly an initial. Now, this was no CSI forensic analysis at work here, just one letter and an expert witness. The initial was a letter F, and the expert witness was a seamstress, Mary C. Brower from East Orange. She examined the two articles and observed that they had been mended. She also examined 5 other handkerchiefs and identified them as having the same mending. Those came from a drawer outside Frances Kluxen's bedroom. I know that's technically circumstantial, but that's also pretty damn slam dunky. However, confidence and that whole reasonable doubt thing must have convinced the Essex County jurors, because after only 3 hours, they returned a verdict of not guilty. Frances Kluxen walked free. Janette Lawrence was buried in Andover Cemetery in Sussex County, some distance from Madison, and her murder technically remains a mystery to this day. And that's it. That's the story of the Kluxen Woods murder of 1921. Except... So you can probably guess that the residents of Madison were not happy with this outcome. Pretty much everyone was convinced of Kluxen's guilt and suspected some shady, undisclosed dealings between the Kluxen family and the state in order to keep him out of jail. Simply put, the neighbors were not kind following his acquittal. Francis couldn't leave his home without being subjected to verbal or even physical abuse.
Some others were looking at me and thinking, "You're a liar! You're a liar! You know something that you're not telling us, you slimy scumbag liar!" That's what people would say to me. And then people would see my wife in the supermarket and they would say hello, but they'd be thinking, there goes that murderer!
In one case, he was allegedly fired upon by 4 men in a passing car. It was in this context that he was approached by local millionaire Monel Sayer, who offered to adopt the teenage Francis, making him heir to Sayer's considerable estate and to get him out of Madison's public eye. A generous offer, to be sure. Which begs the question, why?
He's a pervert, dude.
As to that, speculation has run rampant. Everything from unmitigated altruism to genuine sympathy to romantic interest.
He was a pederast.
Allegedly!
In his book, 7 Jersey Murders, author Gerald Tomlinson seems to subscribe to the latter theory. His rationale being that because of the notoriety and controversy surrounding the case, the only reason such a thing would not have been discussed in the papers would be because the subject was too taboo. He also points to an incident 2 years after the murder where Francis and Sayer walked into the Grace Episcopal Church service and caused an uproar. Frankly, I find the whole thing a bit thin, but lacking for a more cohesive explanation, there it is. To be clear, there is no evidence of nefarious doings on the part of Sayer, who, by the way, is part of the famous Sayer family. For more on them, check out my video on the LeBlanc trial. Suffice to say, this is in fact the same family for which the town of Sayerville is so named. Regardless of the underlying reason, Sayer and Kluxen left Madison for Princeton in 1924, and in 1926, Francis moved out to the West Coast and even joined the Marines for a short while. And that could have been the end of his story. History. Sorry. In 1932, Christmas Day no less, Kluxen, now 25 years old, ran afoul of the law once more, this time for attacking 2 men with a meat cleaver and then robbing them.
All right. Whoa.
Totally not a repeat offender. For which he was fined the sum of $50. I once got fined $50 for going 70 and a 55. These things are not the same. Okay, so maybe that's a one-off. Condense anyone's entire life into a sentence, and some weird stuff is going to fall out. To be fair, he went on to marry and had a daughter. On the other hand, the following year he would also shoot a man in a case that was later determined to be self-defense. He would be charged with 9 burglaries for which he would serve a sentence in San Quentin, so make of that what you will. Alright, so there it is. Now, what do I think? I mean, on the one hand, who's rich enough to influence the police but mends their handkerchiefs? It was monogrammed with an F. Yes, 7/8 of the people in this story have F names. The rosebush string thing is a bit of a disruption, but I could think of a few uses for that at a winery. I mean, cleaning up a red liquid that splashed on your clothes the day after a murder, that's like darkly cartoonish. It was Francis, man. Come on, what are we doing here? Are we past the statute of limitations for libel? Can we just say it now? Like, it was Francis. It was clearly Francis. The cops covered it up. Moving on. The rest of the Lawrence Borland family would remain in the area, eventually being interred along their sister and daughter in the same Andover plot. The site is today marked with 5 headstones. The murder of young Janette officially remains a mystery to this day. It all serves as a grim reminder to remain vigilant in your surroundings, to beware the influence of powerful people, and to keep your children close. That'll about do it for me. If you've stuck with me this far, thank you so much for watching. Sources in the description as usual. This has been Words and Coffee. Until next time.